By the start of the second decade of the 19th century, Napoleon was living in a mode best described as, "I've basically already won Europe." France dominated the continent. Crowns were handed out to relatives. Former enemies sat among the allies pretending they were perfectly happy with the arrangement. There was only one serious problem left: Britain, an island with a navy, money, and an economy that simply could not be finished off by conventional war. That is exactly why Napoleon came up with the continental system. The idea of shutting all of Europe to British trade and choking London economically. On paper, the plan looked brilliant. In reality, it was crooked. Britain kept trading anyway, through smuggling, grey schemes, and neutral countries, while European economies were the ones that truly began to suffocate. Russia suffered especially hard. Grain exports fell, revenues shrank, merchants grew angry, and the nobility watched it all with a clear, "And why exactly do we need this?" expression. Formally, Russia was France's ally. After the War of 1807, the emperors met at Tilsit, exchanged embraces and smiles, and reached an agreement. Russia would support the blockade of Britain, and Napoleon would respect Russian interests in Eastern Europe. It looked elegant and symbolic, and, as it turned out, extremely temporary. The first serious irritant was the Polish question. Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw on lands that had previously been under Russian control or that of its allies. Officially, this was a reform and a new state. In practice, it was a warning sign. Poland had long been a chronic problem for Russia. Uprisings, nationalist projects, constant interference by neighboring powers. The revival of Polish statehood near the border looked less like a friendly gesture and more like a blueprint for future trouble. Next came a dynastic issue that is often underestimated. Napoleon wanted to seal the alliance not with words, but with marriage. He proposed marrying Alexander's younger sister, Anna Pavlovna. For him, this was a way to legitimize himself among Europe's old dynasties and bind Russia tightly to his system. For the Romanovs, it was close to an insult. Napoleon was a new man, a product of revolutionary chaos, and no one was eager to give a Grand Duchess to him. Russia stalled, avoided a direct refusal, and fed him promises. Napoleon waited almost a year, and then drew his conclusions. He married the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise. This was not a romantic flourish, but a demonstrative political move. Austria was a long-standing rival of Russia in Central Europe. The marriage sent a clear signal. If you don't want to be closer, I'll find others. For Alexander, it was painful and unmistakable. But what finally broke the relationship was something else. Napoleon violated previous understandings and annexed Oldenburg, a tiny but politically sensitive territory ruled by a relative of the Russian imperial family. It was a direct slap at the spirit of Tilsit. Not strategically important, but symbolically brutal. At the same time, Russia began to sabotage the continental system with decreasing subtlety. Trade with Britain continued through intermediaries. Ports were closed temporarily. Customs officials looked the other way. Napoleon saw all of this and took it as a personal betrayal. In his worldview, an ally either obeys fully or becomes an enemy. By this point, both sides understood. The question was no longer whether war would happen, but when. Napoleon knew that an operation against Russia would not be a routine campaign. Vast distances, weak infrastructure, and a climate that does not care about your plans. And yet he went ahead. He assembled a colossal army, the largest he had ever commanded. But there was an important detail. It was not a French army. The French made up less than half. The rest were allies, vassals, and reluctant partners. Some had motivation, some were exhausted by constant wars, and some had no desire at all to die for someone else's ambitions. The command structure was worrying as well. Parts of the army were led by Napoleon's relatives, appointed more for family ties than for experience. This was no longer the compact, perfectly controlled machine that had crushed Europe at the start of his career. It was a giant that was hard to steer. Napoleon led roughly 600,000 men into Russia, sincerely believing that such mass could crush anyone. His logic was simple and repeatedly proven. Wars are won by armies, capitals fall, elites negotiate, and the people stay silent. That had worked in Italy, Austria, and Prussia. In Russia, the formula began to fail almost immediately. Napoleon's strategy was built around the rapid destruction of the enemy's main forces. He wanted to force a decisive battle near the border, defeat the Russian armies one by one, and finish the campaign in 5 or 6 weeks. That is why he kept pushing forward, accelerating marches, and growing irritated whenever the Russians withdrew. To him, retreat looked like weakness. In reality, it was a strategy. The Russians were playing a different game. Their goal was not to win beautifully. Their goal was to survive, preserve the army, and wear the enemy down. So what did the invasion actually look like? Napoleon did not march into Russia chaotically. He followed a proven model. He split the Grande Armée into several large groups. In the center were the main forces under his personal command, moving through Vilna toward Smolensk. From the north, MacDonald's Corps covered the direction toward Riga and St. Petersburg. From the south, Schwarzenberg's Austrians and Reynier's Saxons were supposed to pin down Russian forces and prevent them from striking the flank. The idea was straightforward. Press the Russian armies, cut them apart, and destroy them piece by piece, exactly as Napoleon had done dozens of times in Europe. The Russians also began the campaign with several armies, each with its own task. The First Western Army under Barclay de Tolly covered the northwest and the road to St. Petersburg. It was the first to encounter Napoleon. Barclay understood perfectly well that if he accepted battle at the border, the French army would use its numerical superiority and crush him. So he chose organized retreat, constantly slowing the enemy with rearguard actions. The Second Western Army under Prince Bagration operated farther south. Napoleon planned to cut it off and destroy it separately by throwing Davout and Jerome's forces against it. Bagration responded with maneuver, changing routes, slipping out of danger, and at all costs trying to link up with Barclay. His task was not to win, but to survive and preserve his army. The Third Army under General Tormasov covered the southern direction and tied down the Austrians and Saxons, preventing Napoleon's allies from acting freely. As a result, instead of a swift blow, Napoleon found himself with an extended front and constant uncertainty. The Russians were not defending territory. They were defending the army. They gave up space but preserved strength in order to deliver a decisive battle later against a weakened Napoleonic force. And this is where things start to get really interesting. In Russia, what became known as the Patriotic War was proclaimed, not officially, but in the heart of every Russian. Napoleon was not seen here as a liberator or a new ruler. He was seen as an invader, and no one intended to submit to him. Napoleon, however, was used to obedience. He expected to feed his army through war itself, by taking supplies from markets, warehouses, villages, and local trade. He counted on the compliance of the local population, and at some point realized his mistake. In Russia, this mechanism was deliberately broken. Peasants, nobles, and ordinary people rose as one. Grain was burned, livestock driven away, supplies hidden or destroyed. Villages were emptied in advance. This was not flight, but principle. Leave the enemy nothing, even at the cost of one's own ruin. The French army marched forward and was already starving in summer, because it was not just fighting an army, but an entire country. Alongside the regular forces, the Russian population launched a large-scale partisan war against Napoleon. As early as the summer of 1812, French rear areas were no longer safe. Foraging parties were wiped out, small detachments disappeared, courier lines were constantly broken. Partisan units under Davidov, Figner, and Seslevin operated in the Smolensk and Moscow regions, striking communications, depots, and crossings. Platov's Cossacks systematically disrupted French reconnaissance, depriving Napoleon of reliable information about Russian movements. As a result, the Grande Armée began to lose control. Orders arrived late, supplies failed, rear security collapsed. Guerrilla warfare became a constant source of pressure and sharply limited Napoleon's options even before a decisive battle. The first such clash was the battle for Smolensk. Smolensk marked the moment when the Russian command consciously decided to change the tempo of the war. Continued maneuvering was becoming harder. Distances were shrinking, armies were converging, and pressure from the court and society was growing. The decision was made not simply to retreat, but to test Napoleon, to see how he would behave in a major engagement and what price he would pay for taking a city. The Russians had no intention of holding Smolensk at any cost. The goal was different. Tie down the French, inflict maximum damage, and withdraw again while preserving the army. That is exactly what happened. The fighting was stubborn, artillery thundered on both sides, and the French had to storm fortifications rather than simply walk in. Losses were heavy, the pace of the advance slowed, and when Napoleon finally entered Smolensk, he found not a victory, but a burned-out shell. The Russian army had withdrawn in good order, without collapsing or losing command and control. The order had been fulfilled. Save the army. Wear down the French. It was at Smolensk that Napoleon first clearly saw the problem. The city was taken, the flag raised, but there was no result. No capitulation, no negotiations, no shattered enemy army. In Europe, this was usually the point where peace talks began. Here, there was silence and retreating columns that remained fully combat-capable. At that moment, the choice became brutally clear. To stop meant admitting that there would be no quick victory. To pull back meant showing weakness to allies and enemies alike. Napoleon chose to move forward. Moscow became the goal. Not a military one, but a symbolic one. He still believed that its capture would break Russia politically. The Russian side also understood that retreat had limits. Pulling back further without a major battle would damage morale, both in the army and across the country. That was when the crucial decision was made to change the commander-in-chief. Kutuzov returned from the southern front, where he had just concluded a war with the Ottoman Empire. Old, experienced, having lost an eye in earlier campaigns, he rushed to the army. He was not a new strategist with unexpected ideas. He was a man the soldiers trusted and who understood the core truth. Napoleon could not be stopped by clever tricks, only worn down and met with force at the right moment. Kutuzov did not reject Barclay's strategy. He accepted it as the foundation. But he added what had been missing before, the decision to fight a decisive battle. Not for a map, not for a city, but to halt the enemy. The position was chosen near the village of Borodino on the road to Moscow. It was not ideal, but it blocked the route and allowed battle to be forced. Here, the Russian army deployed and, for the first time in the entire campaign, said plainly, "We go no farther." By Borodino, both sides were already exhausted, yet still enormous by the standards of the era. Napoleon had about 130,000 men and roughly 580 guns. Kutuzov's army had around 120,000 troops, including militia, and about 640 guns. Neither side had a numerical advantage, a rare situation in which Napoleon lacked his usual edge. Borodino was never meant to be a quick triumph. It was a battle of attrition, where both sides knew in advance that nothing would come easily. The Bagration flèches, the Raevski redoubt, endless attacks and counterattacks. It all came down to one word: endure. The Russian army did not expect a miracle or rely on a brilliant maneuver. It stood firm, fully aware that the price would be terrible. The price was beyond measure. Borodino became the bloodiest single-day battle of the 19th century. By conservative estimates, around 6,000 men were killed or wounded every hour. The French army lost roughly a quarter of its strength. The Russian army about 30%. In one day, the French fired around 60,000 artillery rounds, the Russians about 50,000. The battlefield literally ground men into dust. That day, Napoleon did everything he knew how to do. He broke through defenses, seized key positions, and remained on the field. Formally, it was a victory, and on the map, it looked like one. But he failed to achieve the main objective. The Russian army was not destroyed. It did not disintegrate or ask for peace. It withdrew in good order, preserving command and the ability to continue the war. Later, Napoleon himself acknowledged the dual nature of that day. He called Borodino his greatest battle, and at the same time, his most difficult. His famous words captured it precisely. The French proved themselves worthy of victory, and the Russians earned the right to be invincible. It was a rare admission from a man who usually measured war only by results. And it was at that moment that Napoleon first understood that victory on the battlefield no longer meant victory in the war. Russia did not break at Smolensk, and it did not break at Borodino, which meant that ahead lay not a conclusion, but a continuation, far heavier than anything that had come before. After Borodino, the question ceased to be tactical and became existential. The Russian army survived, but was exhausted. Losses were horrific, reserves limited, and another general battle at the gates of Moscow threatened not victory, but total exhaustion. In the village of Fili, a military council was held, one that entered history as one of the hardest decisions ever made. Kutuzov understood. If the army dies, the country dies with it. Moscow mattered, but the army mattered more. After a long silence, he took responsibility and ordered the city abandoned. This was not a decision to surrender, but a decision to continue the war by other means. Moscow was abandoned almost completely. When Napoleon entered the city, he expected capitulation, delegations, keys, submission. He was waiting for the symbolic finale of the campaign. Instead, he found an empty city, silence, locked houses, and soon after, fires. Historians still argue over who set Moscow ablaze and to what extent, but the fact remains. The city burned, warehouses, food supplies, and shelter vanished. Napoleon found himself in a capital that gave him nothing. It was a psychological shock. The enemy refused to acknowledge defeat, refused to play by Europe's familiar rules. The capital was surrendered. But the war was not. Napoleon spent several weeks in Moscow, waiting for a peace offer that never came. The Russian army had vanished. He did not know where it was, what condition it was in, or whether it intended to fight at all. It was at this moment that Kutuzov made his decisive move, the Tarutino maneuver. Formerly retreating along the Ryazan road, the Russian army suddenly turned and set up camp near Tarutino, cutting Napoleon off from the south. That region held untouched lands, food supplies, fodder, and the possibility of wintering and rebuilding strength. The French were denied access. Napoleon found himself caught in a strategic trap. Moscow was burned out, supplies were gone, allies were wavering, and the army was shrinking. An attempt to break south failed. In the end, he was forced to retreat along the already devastated Smolensk road. The same route he had taken toward Moscow while destroying everything in his path. Now that road became a road of death. Frost, hunger, disease, and constant attacks by Cossacks and partisans turned the retreat into a catastrophe. The withdrawal was not organized. The army disintegrated. Soldiers fell behind, got lost, abandoned their weapons, hid in villages. Some tried to survive by passing themselves off as craftsmen or farm laborers. A number of Frenchmen remained in Russia permanently. Some were indeed sold as serfs, formally or informally, as labor. Others, especially the educated ones, settled on noble estates, becoming French tutors, governesses, or musicians. Descendants of Napoleonic soldiers lived in Russia for decades afterward, often no longer remembering how they had arrived there. The losses were total. Of an army that had numbered around 600,000, only miserable remnants made it back. By various estimates, between 20 and 30,000 men still capable of fighting. The rest were killed, died of disease, froze to death, were captured, or stayed in Russia. This was not merely a military failure. It was the destruction of an army as an instrument of power. After Russia, Napoleon was never the same. He fought again, he even won battles. But the myth of invincibility was burned along with Moscow. The Russians demonstrated something Europe had not understood. A capital can be abandoned without losing the war. A battle can be lost and the war still won. In 1812, victory belonged not to maneuvers or cannons, but to endurance, space, and the refusal to admit defeat even when the enemy stood in the heart of the country.